You probably don't need me to state the obvious, but you just clicked on this video. Why did you do that? You'd probably say something simple like how the title or thumbnail grabbed your attention, and that's a pretty clear-cut conclusion. It doesn't even really feel like a whole or impactful decision, does it? But why did it grab your attention? Maybe you were struggling with motivation recently and thought a new look at daily life would help. But why is that? Was there a loss recently in your past to demotivate you, and how did you experience that loss? Was it a job, an item, a person? And then why, when, how, and where did you have that thing or job or know that person? If we begin to dig, suddenly what seemed like a decision without meaning can actually turn into a jumbled mess of our psyche and tons of decisions we made prior to it. And we could do this with every single choice we make in a day, from what we had for breakfast to the shirt we decide to wear to what we did after work. Yet most of these things don't even register as decisions to us. Most of them are decided based on rules or principles that we live by. For breakfast every day I have a Pop-Tart because it's easier to throw into my bag at 6 a.m. I wear the same 5 shirts each week because I decided they were my work shirts. After work I made this video because I decided I would release one a week on Thursdays at 2:15 p.m. Even though I face thousands of decisions every day, I could hardly name a handful of them that I actively pondered, because instead I use these rules and principles to simplify life. It's easier that way, but does easier mean better? Or is my decision to do so part of that gnawing dissatisfaction with everyday life that most of us feel? And further, is there any realistic way to actually do this differently? Today I want to take a look at these hidden decisions of everyday life and how we may be able to find a lot more value in them than we've been led to think. To do this, we'll be using the movie I Want to Eat Your Pancreas, the 2018 tale of a dying girl who chooses to live and a living boy who has to learn how. I'll be explaining most of the necessary plot and detail of the movie as we go along to make this as accessible as possible, but the entire movie is available for free on Facebook for some reason, coming up on the first page if you just Google "Watch I Want to Eat Your Pancreas." I'm not saying right or wrong, I'm just stating the fact that it is right there. Now, the movie opens on the funeral of Sakura, one of the movie's 2 main characters, while the other unnamed protagonist muses about such an event, the number of people and their tears as markers of an impactful life, himself remaining in bed staring at their last exchanged text. Him to her, "I want to eat your pancreas." A flashback returns us to a time when she was still alive, and this interaction they share juxtaposes their characters. Sakura begins putting books away on the wrong shelf, placing historical fiction in the history section. To her, there isn't that much of a difference, or at least not one worth the extra effort. Maybe even someone would end up researching the real history from a story anyway. I mean, this channel is a testament to that, if nothing else. Instead of placing things where they're supposed to be based on a rule, she's placing them where they could have a greater impact, craft, and experience, even if it's a bit more complex to find. He, on the other hand, directs her to the category codes, a set of clear, defined, and absolute rules for finding books. You'll find exactly what you need quickly, but only that, unable to stumble into something tangential. This interaction goes deeper than just introducing their priorities, but rather serves as an explainer of how they and we live our lives. Now, a code for book placement simplifies something which is really rather complex when you get deep into it. There's so many genres, each one covering the same topic as others for different purposes and within different contexts, written at different times by completely different people with different sources of information, and I could say a lot more variations of the word differently. The point is, there's a lot more overlap between history and historical fiction than it might actually seem. It would be a dizzying array to enter a shelf simply dedicated to, say, cybernetics. You'd have Dick and Gibson spinning their narratives, while scientific publications explained how, when, and why, and old books that were completely wrong about it all at once. And so, to make life easier, we don't do that. We cut down on those possibilities to just the most relevant ones. We get in and get out, for better or worse. What if we didn't? Wouldn't it actually be kind of cool just to spend an hour or two in a shelf dedicated to a topic in all of those contexts? To find a detailed analysis of how we can modify our bodies, the accounts of when we had before, and authors questioning what would be like in the future. Wouldn't it almost feel kind of more meaningful to get lost in a topic like that? Now, I'm biased because that kind of exploration is kind of my whole thing, but the fact that people are here right now shows I'm at least not alone in it. So why don't we do such a thing if it's desirable? Well, first of all, because it's not allowed. Our world is one run by efficiency. Under stress from deadlines and grades and regulations, we'd be frustrated out of our minds to lose even more time finding the sources we need for a paper or for work. And even doing it as a hobby with no restrictions, the toil and requirements of daily life would still drag us away from such a thing early. No one can lose 2 hours with a yard to cut or taxes to do or work to prepare for the next day. But we need to go a step back, because what causes those factors to exist? Well, I disagree with much of how our world turned out. A lot of those systems began with the intent of simplicity, or at least that's how they're sold to us, and in some way there is truth to it. They're of taking a complex world and making it easier to understand, even if they were hijacked by the desire for power and capital later on. Yes, working every single day from 9 to 5 is exhaustingly boring, but it's simple. You don't have to look really when a job is. You know that anything you apply to is pretty much going to be within your schedule because of the timing. And it means that everyone is supposedly free at the same time. It's simpler than everyone working at any and all times, even though it crushes us. I want to place a little addition here after editing. We should probably view these things less as tools for simplicity and more as tools abusing simplicity for the sake of control. It's easier to control all of your workers if they're in the same place at the same time, and it's less work for those in power as well. We go along with them because there is no choice but to do so. They have power, but also to some degree because it is simple for us. The transaction is giving up power to someone else for simplicity, one which is very heavily weighted to those who receive power. As such, we can reason a somewhat inherent drive towards the brains having to perform the least calculation possible to reach an answer, that is, a strive for simplicity. This is why we have systems like book codes. They're inbuilt principles that make life easier to live, most often by reducing our decisions to be minor enough that they happen in the background and aren't really even considered as such. He is an embodiment of these principles in their nature, as his entire being is dedicated to living the simplest life possible. He stays home alone and reads, works in a quiet library where no one will talk to him, all to maintain his purposeful lack of friends or even interaction on the whole. This is eventually broken by Sakura, as her lost diary titled Living with Dying is picked up by the book-interested protagonist, leading him to being the only one outside of her family who knows of her pancreas disorder that will lead to her early death. Intrigued by someone whose reaction to learning all of this is simply, "You don't say," Sakura forces him into her life, where he eventually explains pieces of how he maintains his own. He says that others think of him as the boring classmate. He's uninteresting, and so they have no desire to think on him further than that. It's the simplest relationship anyone can have, only the most basic necessity of incidental observation and nothing more. He goes on, when asked if he's ever confirmed this, to simply state, "It doesn't matter if I'm right or not, it's what I believe." The boring classmate is a trope he made up in his own head. We see that he doesn't care what others think of him, he only cares if what they think of him leaves them with no desire to interact with him. To keep this in order, he abuses an aspect inherent to our minds. The truth is simply what we believe. If he thinks that they think he's boring, then there's no need to ever develop any kind of relationship. Any feeling of "maybe I should talk" is crushed by an overarching and powerful truth. They wouldn't want to anyway. Loneliness becomes an instinct to him because of this rule. It's a convenient truth, one which works backwards from what we want to find justification to pursue it and exclude as much decision as possible. A simpler option than facing our own desires to their full extent. Sometimes we don't want what's best, we just want what's easiest. But this manifestation for simplicity is seen most in his preference for fiction over reality. This is something that's really inherent to my channel. I've spoken many times about why I do what I do, because stories make sense. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They have defined characters and a very structured plot laid out by an author with the intent to get across some message. Past the covers of the book, the opening and ending credits of a series or a movie, the characters don't grow and change. Their traits are limited to what was written and shown to us by the person who created them. As such, it's entirely possible to break their complexities down into simplicities for our purposes here, allowing us a lens to view ourselves and our own world in an understandable way. But it's just as possible that this concept explains why we prefer escapism. It's not just that these worlds are new and exciting. After all, we can get just as lost in a depressing story as an upbeat one. Edge Runner's constant place in my mind since it came out is proof enough of that. So there must be something else drawing us to them as well, and he shows that this is simplicity. They're worlds which, by definition, unless the author's express purpose was to make no sense, can always be made to be understandable, whereas our world, which is constantly evolving and growing and changing as we are all evolving and growing and changing, can never be fully so. Escapism is also a way to set our minds to a solvable equation when our world itself is entirely unsolvable. Understanding this makes it clear what the point of our protagonist is: to live the least complex life possible. He is an exaggeration of the kinds of rules and principles we all follow every day, even going so far as to explain others through them as well. When Sakura begins to work at the library with him, he asks if this is really how she wants to spend her final days. Wouldn't she rather be hitchhiking in a foreign country, or confessing to a love, or something else wild? Exactly like you'd see in the trope of a dying youth. It's his extreme embodiment of the principle leading him to explain this in others as well. But it is based on truth. He may be entirely a trope as an exaggerated character, but we are all in some way tropes. We act based on principles or rules or tropes, different names for justifications to reduce decisions. Even the concept of the dying youth, say living each day like you're dying, is simply reducing the possibilities we consider to be boring, making the decision easier. Instead of considering each and every detail, we state that some are triumphed by others, some simply don't matter or hold any weight. To see this in his less exaggerated light, the movie introduces Kyoko, Sakura's best friend who's unaware of her condition. She sees how much time the pair is spending together, from working the same job to eating in cafes alone to even overnight trips in the same hotel room, and accepts only one possibility: the pair must be dating. But they aren't, kind of. They dance around the topic, which seems to draw both of their attention, having awkward moments where their desires seem to creep out in their own expressions, from overly dark jokes to a quickly forgiven assault. It seems they themselves don't really understand the connection between them, as they sit half comfortably, half awkwardly between friends and more. This is where we see simplification. There's clearly space between these two terms, but there's no real designation for what lies within there. We normally don't consider that kind of complexity. Kyoko surely doesn't, because despite expressing the situation directly to her, giving a justification of really that she just enjoys his company, Kyoko fails to ever consider seeing something between. She sees evidence of dating and as such won't draw any other conclusion, even when directly told that that's not it. This is the same idea as what he does, taking something complex and simplifying it down. It's not just the space in between that we fail to consider, because what really even is dating when all of us are different, and so each and every situation will be different itself? Do you have a definition for dating? In my experience, it's just something that kind of happens. Even if you agree on it, the terms and exact specifics will always be a bit different. Things get left at each other's places with no acknowledgement or complaint, and they'll stop waiting for you to be done in the shower to use the restroom, or Saturday night plans are assumed, and eventually someone says a term that conflates to partner in some way, and that's that until a breakup. Really, there is no definition. There's only evidence that we typically witness between people and then label as dating, which includes extra assumptions in order to make it simple. What's easier, saying, well, there's someone who spends 4 nights a week at my house that I do things with on Saturday nights and sit close to on the couch, but don't have around my family because my family is weird about people, but then do go around their family when they have family events because their family's a bit cooler than mine. A statement that explains how we do or don't fit the mold, or just saying partner and then calling it a day. We simplify, even at the cost of accurately describing and remembering the meaning behind both ourselves, shown with the protagonist, situations shown with Kyoko, and others shown with both of them. So that's the reality of our world. We take something very grand and complex and reduce it down to understandable chunks. We've said a few times that we do so because complexity is hard, but it's time to zero in more on why it is with a term we've said less: decisions. We are creatures of reason. We take in information around us, process it, and then make decisions based on how we should proceed from this. We are hyper-complex biological machines. Input leads to output, and we will always be receiving input. As such, there is no way we can live without making decisions. What we can do is reduce them, live without awareness of how complex and numerous those decisions are by manipulating those first steps, reducing input or reducing the calculations we perform on the input. Like him, we can take in less information, or like Kyoko, we can process that information simply. Now, are decisions really that complex that we actively manipulate ourselves to cope? Yeah, kind of. Let's look at how Sakura describes them to see this. Our protagonist is feeling quite worthless after assaulting Sakura. He runs off in the rain only to see her stalker ex-boyfriend, who punches him just as Sakura runs out to try and find him. The ex is revealed to be, well, an absolute piece of crap, stating that he punched someone she loves for her because the lead was actually just stalking and threatening her. Her ex knows better than her, obviously, and is just taking care of someone so helpless. Sakura gets him to go away, but confronts another act of justification from the protagonist, who says that she really should be spending her time with someone who cares, like Kyoko, or that very ex who just tried to manipulate her. Real quick aside, right here we see more of the "it's what I believe" justification work. The ex makes up evidence to support what he wants to believe, and the lead ignores evidence right in front of him to justify what he wants to happen, which is being left ill in simplicity once more, just the same. But back on track, he continues, saying ultimately a statement designed to simplify everything they share down to a meaningless nothing. Besides, we two just came across each other by chance. The core of this statement is meaninglessness. Why does any of it matter anyway? It was all just a result of chance. What happens is justified in simple terms because there is no point. They didn't decide to be together. Chance is the simplest option because it's easily ignored and not considered. It has no consideration of our complex beings within it. It is a justification like any other to make ourselves more at peace with everything. But Sakura begins to draw the opposite case that sees the world for what it truly is, a complex mess without pure chance. I chose that notebook, you like books, got interested and picked it up, then you accepted my request. Choices piled up. Yes, they met at the hospital because he picked up a book. But why were they at the hospital? Why that day? Why did he pick up a random book on the floor? Why did she choose that book that caught his eye? Why did she decide to write it all down inside of that book? Why was he even interested in books to begin with? Why did he sit right there to be able to see it? And why did he look in that direction? Then further, why did she drop it? And why was she right in that place to drop it? Each one of these aspects is another layer, a step back which explains the one after it, and with another before it sharing the same effect. We can always go back again and again and again and again and again and again, finding more and more reasons for why something occurred. This isn't just conjecture either, but a property that can be observed in the mathematics that explain our world. I know many of you probably hate math, but I have to put that engineering degree I hate to more use somehow, so I'll do a simple and brief explanation of integrals. Now, in overly simple terms, an integral is the previous, more complex stage of an equation. For example, the integral of the equation right here would turn into this, where c is an undetermined constant. So So rather than me explaining this live and forcing everyone to sit through it, here's a quick sheet. The left side of the screen is the full sheet. The right side is slowly scrolling through it, so it's a bit bigger in case you need that. This will give you the necessary information to understand the math. If you don't want to understand that, in about 10 seconds, you'll move past it anyway. But yeah, if you want to, you can pause to understand the math here. If not, I'll do a quick basic of why it matters, and we can move on. You don't need to know exactly how it works for our purposes if you know that this integrated state is more complex, which it is because each variable grows, holding more sway over the equation, and then more are added each time, including that new constant. In essence, solving the equation gets harder because we are aware of and have to work with more factors, just like the tree backwards when we look at our situations and what caused them. Just because we only observe the small sliver that's present at the end doesn't mean that the rest ceases to exist. This is observed in physics by position, velocity, and acceleration. Position is the integral of velocity, which is the integral of acceleration. By knowing the equation of an object's position, we can integrate to find partially the velocity it needed to arrive there, and one more step back, the acceleration it needed to have that velocity. Without all the factors, each step will have some unknowns, but that just makes it more like real life. We can't be aware of every factor, and each step back will introduce some uncertainty. I know this was confusing, but it just shows that this isn't just philosophical rambling Sakura is stating, it has a basis in the nature of our universe. And as she implies, there is a value to be found in this. We find meaning in complexity. To try and somewhat stay on track, we can look at stories, which is our protagonist's favorite thing, as an example of this. Even though we crave simplicity, and as we said, stories can be seen as an offshoot of this, there's more to it than that. After all, writing a story isn't something simple, that's a complex act someone did. And if we simply wanted everything to be immediately understandable and easy, then why would we seek out complex stories? Instead of watching I Want to Eat Your Pancreas, I could just read a children's book where all the morals and implications are spelled out in clear language and without extraneous detail to dig through. However, that isn't what I do, it isn't what you do, and it isn't even what the protagonist does either, since he's unfamiliar with Sakura's favorite book, which is a very popular children's book. The marker of simplicity himself dives into complex stories. So we must find some value in complexity, and you could argue the reason for that is our own implications in decision. For narratives, it would be our perspective in dissecting them, but the movie shows this through the repeated use of games of chance for truth or dare. It's taking the randomness and complexity of the world, narrowing it down, and then making us a crucial aspect of that branching decision tree through our choices. This is a game of chance. There's no way one could accurately predict what will happen next without knowing the position of every card on the table, and even then, the other person could still randomly select the highest value card. Yet, even if we don't have control over the outcome, we are necessary to making one of these possible outcomes into reality. There exists probability, and we turn those percentages into one definite outcome. It doesn't matter if it's 80% or 20%, we're the one which makes one of those happen. Even if we choose based on a rule each time, like the card closest to oneself, we still made a decision which impacts the game. So when we combine these aspects, we see that the world is endlessly complex, and also that such complexity arises from our being since we are what turns probability into truth. With this in mind, we then have value in ourselves in every decision we make, because those decisions in turn will endlessly change the future, becoming one of those complex equations in the past when we look back. The world is not truly meaningless and random, even if there are aspects of chance. It's simply easiest to say it is. And we can see why that's easiest. Think about actually considering all of this. You pick up a book on the hospital floor. You're at the hospital to have stitches removed. You had to have stitches removed because of appendicitis you had some weeks back. You had appendicitis because it was triggered from certain bacteria in your intestinal tract, say. You had those certain bacteria in there because of a meal you ate a few days before. And then you ate that meal a few days before because you decided to go with your parents to the store to get snacks you actually wanted. And then you wanted those snacks because you had them as a kid, and you had them as a kid because you picked out the colorful packaging when you saw them, and you can see this starts to become unwieldy and complex, having more so-ons and so-ons and so-ons. Every single point of division in every single day is a decision with a tree just like this behind it. And that's just one line of it. We could have explored any of the reasons why, like why you liked books, why you looked over to notice the book, why you sat in that seat, and so on and so on and so on again. If we had to consider the factors behind every single decision we make, we'd go absolutely insane and the species would go extinct, because to decide what to eat in the morning would take 10 years and we would all die. Not to mention that each step back we go introduces some level of uncertainty, and as such we'd never be able to even finish the process with any real certainty. So our tropes and principles and rules are a necessity. We sort books according to a code because it would be impossible to live if we allowed everything to be as complex as it truly is. We assume two people who stay alone in the same bed in a hotel are dating because that's just what we learn of couples. We do or don't act according to the trope we give ourselves. Some things just have to be simple and efficient. Even Sakura caves to organizing the books by a code when he's late to arrive at work, so she has to do it instead. So we can once again find pessimism in all of this. If the world is supposedly so beautiful and influenced by our decisions, why do we feel so much like it isn't? Why are we forced to neglect all of our impact just to be able to keep moving forward in that very world? Is the world itself a paradox of value, the very reason we have it also being the reason it is kept from us? To some degree, yes, that is true. We must simplify. But the trick, as so many things come down to, is a matter of balance. When we recognize that everything is a result of our decisions, we also know that everything is a decision. Within reason, there are some things we can't help, like when and where and to who we are born, and those inherent conditions will, at the very least, influence our decisions or cut out certain possibilities. The same goes for things like having a job or eating or paying taxes. There are certain things we are forced to decide on due to the consequences of not doing so. For example, being a certain race or living where you're born or being less fortunate are not choices. But looking at the ones which are less coerced, we can find a value once more in knowing that everything, although its impact and complexity will take some time to show and be known, is our decision, because that means we also get to decide what we do and do not simplify, working under the assumption that for the world to function, some things must not be seen as complex. This is because what we dedicate our limited time to processing the complexity of is what we give value to, and as such, find value in. For example, Kyoko chose to simplify their relationship of the protagonist in Sakura because she did not want to provide some of her limited space for value to someone she saw as having no value. She spent that value on Sakura herself, believing she was worthy of someone truly stellar. She let her best friend be complex in her head, understanding all of her little sources of value. She was more than just a trope, but he was as he believed himself to be for her. The boring classmate. A trope, not something worth allowing complexity to. Meanwhile, we witness from the inside how valuable this relationship really is between him and Sakura. At first, he tries to excuse her away with tropes and their assumptions, saying that a dying teenager should be out doing more interesting things, or pulling the "we're complete opposites" card as a reason to explain why they probably shouldn't get along. However, as things progress, we see this drop. Their first interaction only happens because he was coerced. He can't help that she got the same job as him, that's just how it is. But when he goes to eat with her for the first time, she manipulates his lack of choice into one. She points out that he is the one who told her to live as she wishes, and that she wishes for him to go with her to get food. Here, the simplest option for him is to just go with her, both because she has justified it, and also denying it would take more time, energy, and reasoning than not. While there, Sakura begins to get him to open up in a similar way, asking questions or bringing up certain topics based on the same principle, making the easiest option being just to go along. They continue like this for a while, him mostly being dragged along but relenting, slowly along the way gaining enough information to even develop the trope of complete opposites for them to begin with. And there, things begin to show value. For that assumption, he has to know something about her, like how their tastes in meat differ. He didn't like the offer that she does. While it is small, like anything else, it is an important decision tree, which we see by how close they become from moments like this, and since he considers it, it is something which he allows to have value by not simplifying, until he tries to do so with the trope. But it is the beginning of value. As the relationship progresses more and more, he starts asking genuine questions about her when forced to with truth or dare, likely an act on her part of coercing him into doing so, but he still decides to ask these deep questions and justifies it by saying he wants to know how she ended up like this. He realizes that she isn't a trope, isn't something simply explained by a few words. She is someone quite complex and difficult to understand, as everyone is when you really look. And then she is valued by him because despite that, he continues to look and try to understand, just like we would do with a depthful story. He digs and digs and digs until he can find the intricate details, he fails to capture them in full, and then he keeps digging away hoping to finally get there. This arose, these beautiful moments of intense connection, the life-changing scenes we all imagine having because she chose to devote limited value, complexity to him, and he began to feel that value and show it back. The ending, where he goes on to become friends with Kyoko despite her hate for him, is the same principle as he performs a very similar action. He finds someone who wants nothing to do with him due to assumptions, and then begins to break the assumptions drawn through simplicity by showing a complex reaction to them. He and Kyoko can be friends because he presented her with value, and like he did before, she saw it and reciprocated. In all of this, there is something to restate, which are those tropes, principles, and rules that we live by, and how they reduce decision to something we don't even notice. We can't forget that our lead became how he was because he drew one single guiding principle to determine everything, the trope of the boring classmate. Part of the lesson here today is that such hard set rules go against what we just discussed in selectively providing value. To find love in Sakura, he had to stop being the boring classmate because that rule conflicted with something so complex. Well, again, we may not be complete exaggerations like him. We have to be aware of how we do this in our own lives and with our own likely smaller principles. What do we immediately exclude by these rules, and are we possibly missing something positive in them? It's hard to ever really be certain because of the reality that a majority of decisions will not reveal their value until much, much, much later. As we said, will picking up a random book in the hospital lead you to finding the most positive relationship of your entire life? There's no way to ever say, kind of just like our games of chance. I think Sakura can once again prevent this from turning into pessimism, though. When we consider how she lived her life, and the thought process she put behind these seemingly minor decisions. When you're originally conversing with your protagonist in the library, they have an exchange following her rejection of the dying youth trope. She says that she has fun doing normal everyday stuff, as well as how every day is as valuable as any other, so that shouldn't everyone be living like they're dying since we can all technically die at any time? And then, not 1 minute later, she presents a list of things she wants to do before she dies, promoting the response from him that, isn't that a contradiction to what she just said? And it is. That's the point. As she says later, you're gravely mistaken if you think there's a purpose to everything I say, which is an inherent rejection of living by hard set principles. It is saying that there is no overarching explanation for what she says or how she acts, it is just what happens in the moment. A complete embracing of decision. This is seen in her seemingly nonsensical, on-the-spot reasoning for many of her actions. After running away from kicking an asshole in the genitals, yes, that happens, she and the lead end up right outside of a cafe called Cafe Spring, which she points out is perfect for the name Sakura since cherry blossoms bloom in spring. She says, in fact, it's so perfect they have to go in. Think about this with respect to the rest of the day. She's devoting her limited complexity to her new friend, which inherently reasons that there are other things in the day which cannot hold complexity. Many of us would use principles to solve this, reducing our decisions by, say, just going to a cafe that we already know of close by. But what she's doing, since she has no such principles, is just reasoning as to why she's taking this action on the spot, which means embracing the fundamental and value-providing aspect of decision-making, but without the complexity that would overwhelm or slow down her life. Rules and principles and tropes already fail to make sense or be true many times, so why should true and genuine on-the-spot decisions be any different? Is it really wrong to, within reason, embrace the fact that the truth is simply what we believe it to be and convince ourselves we are making meaningful decisions right then and there? We can't slow down and understand the whole chain of events that led to them, but instead of calling it random, we can apply a temporary principle to it, like saying it's too perfect a pairing not to go in. That way, we still respect the meaningfulness of the situation, our active participation which makes it so, and all without needing it to be so complex that we lose value in other areas. It's not a grand revelation that changes the whole world, or really even tells us how to live our lives differently, or makes everything make sense. It is something which acts within the reason and confines of our own world, and decides to find a value within those factors, without disrespecting the harshness the world casts upon us. It is not living like you're dying, which is just another trope to simplify our behavior. It is quite simply understanding that we are living and what that really means. Knowing that we in this world are a completely incomprehensible bundle of choices growing exponentially every single day, which has its roots already lost to time, and then denying the pessimism that comes from such a thing. And even as a pretty heavy pessimist myself, I agree. I think there are many things we should be angry or sad about, and most of those things are ones which simplify the world in ways that it doesn't need to be. National cruelty over pointless random lines in the sand, strict enforcement of lifestyles that have no truth in human nature, the injustice that is so often inherent from birthright, these are factors that deserve anger and rage. If we find simple value in the ones that can't be helped, the natural complexity of the world, then we can save our energy to deal with the unnatural yet strictly enforced complexities that we just mentioned, like the ones of our societies. As such, I think that what we learned today is something very valuable. Like anything else, it is in some ways a principle to live by. We have to have those. But it is one which is positive, and one whose entire point is to shapeshift to maintain that value with respect to how hard simply existing can be. It is playing within the bounds that can never be changed, the very form of what it means to even be human to begin with. Maybe that's a lot for a relatively simple movie, but that's kind of what we're all about here. I guess that's one of my guiding principles, is looking into movies too deep, but that's something I allow to be complex and give value to, and that makes my life feel a lot more valuable, trust me. So that's that. You can probably tell I'm off script now by the fact that I'm laughing and rambling, and I'm laughing because I'm rambling, and this is why I don't go off script. But I think this was a really interesting one. Let me know if there's more you want to see from this movie. I think there's actually a lot I didn't address about it, despite really going long here. I think it's just kind of, I talked about more of the premise behind the characters and analyzed the characters a bit without going super deep into the specifics of the situation. We were just kind of looking at what caused the situations. So I think there's still more in here if this is something more you'd like to see. Let me know how this came out, because this is one that, as I was writing, it felt very good, but it tends to be those things, whenever I go to edit them, don't feel as good. So I really am curious what people thought of this one. I'll also say there's important links in the pinned comment. Hey, Twitter when new videos are released, and occasionally you'll see stupid pictures of me and things. Discord, where it's the same thing, but also we have a few discussions and things. And then, most importantly, Patreon, where the lovely people above me support me right now and help me keep rambling to people on the internet. But anyway, I'll just say thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you again soon.